Well, good morning. It really is a pleasure to get to be with you. Let's take our Bibles over to Acts chapter 8. We'll get started in Acts chapter 8 in just a second. The closer we got to the meeting, the more people came up to me and said, "Oh, you're going to West Mason? Those people are awesome." Michelle Wayne and her family sends their greetings. They had nothing but wonderful things to say. And then I stopped for dinner last night on the drive up and had dinner with some friends in Lexington, Kentucky. And they're like, "Oh, is that where you're going? They're just wonderful people up there. We love worshiping there before camp." And they just had nothing but good to say about you. And I've certainly been greeted very warmly this morning, and I appreciate such a warm greeting. I'm looking forward to our time to study God's Word together this week. We're going to start this morning talking about the zeal of Paul. And this lesson is something that obviously it's not in the workbook. This is a new lesson, but it came out of a conversation that I had with a brother in Christ down in Montgomery, Alabama. He came to me after the very first day of the meeting and he said, "Well, I'm a little bit relieved because I was not looking forward to this." And I thought, okay, this is going to be a neat conversation. And he said, "Yeah, I did not want a series on zeal." And I thought, well, who doesn't want like a passionate relationship with God? What's going on? But you know what? I immediately understood him as he explained himself. He said, when I hear the word zeal, I think about the zeal of the Pharisees. He thinks about that zeal that is very quick to criticize others rather than to look at the log that's kind of in your own eye and have some self-examination. He thought about the zeal of the Pharisees in terms of binding the traditions or man-made commandments, things that would actually hinder someone's walk with God. He thought about zeal about externals, about those things that we might put on for display, even though we might be lacking a gratitude in our heart for God's grace. And as he explained himself, I thought, yeah, I wouldn't really want a week of that either. I want us to look at the life of Paul this morning because Paul, as a Pharisee, was at the top of his class. He was the kind of guy that absolutely had that kind of external zeal, the kind of zeal that we read about here in Acts chapter 8, beginning in verse 3, to restrict others rather than to draw them closer to the Lord. So I think this is really profitable as we're studying about zeal and as you guys are going through the workbook to recognize everything God says about this misdirected and uninformed kind of zeal. It's the kind of zeal that needs to mature. It's the kind of zeal that needs to be refined, a kind of zeal that needs to be influenced by the example of Christ. So here's kind of the three things we're going to do for class this morning. First, we're going to look at where Paul was as a Pharisee and what made that zeal kind of different than his zeal as a Christian. Secondly, we're going to look at the things that he learned that helped him make that transformation. And third, we're going to see how his zeal was really shining as an imitator of Christ. So let's look at Acts chapter 8 here, beginning in verse 3 and verse 4 at the need for refining Paul's zeal. Verse 3, Saul began ravaging the church, entering house after house, and dragging off men and women, and he would put them in prison. Just stop in verse 3 for a minute. Go through these phrases and look at the intensity. Look at the vigor in Paul's zeal here. When he says that he's ravaging the church, that's the New American Standard that I'm reading from this morning. Paul's ravaging the church. That's an adjective that we often associate like with a wild animal, right? If you can just imagine a lion going from prey to prey to prey, ravaging the savannah. Paul has an intensity here that is on the attack. It's very ferocious. But he doesn't just say that he's ravaging the church. This is house to house. This is multiple repeated locations. You know, if you had someone like Paul that just came in and they had gotten a copy of the directory, and one or two of the elders or one or two of the deacons or one or two of the Bible class teachers, if they'd been drug off to prison, you would say, whoa, this is really intense. But if he didn't just stop with one or two, but if he got a hold of that directory and he went through over and over and every family one by one was coming after Christians for their faith, that would be very concerning. And they're not just quietly being escorted, right? Luke, as he says this in verse 3, says that he's dragging off these people. They're going not of their own free will and not really even going towards a fair trial. The Pharisees had not given Jesus a fair trial, and Paul isn't really going to do that for these people either. He's ferocious. He's consistent. He's dragging them off. And I would say that in verse 3, we see there's zero mercy. Because he's not just coming after the men. He's not just coming after heads of households. He's not saying, well, you are the one that's responsible for this, but the women and children will show some. No, it's men and women. Verse 3 says, no distinguish, no mercy. He's dragging them off, and he's putting them in prison. They're confined, and they are awaiting unjust trials. What if that was actually happening here at West Mason? From house to house, someone attacking the church that ferociously. You would think that that would be enough. But when you read verse 4, therefore those who had been scattered went about preaching the word, you see that he isn't willing to stop. And it's so bad that the people haven't lost their faith. They're still preaching the word, but they can't stay here anymore. Come over to chapter 9. In chapter 9, you would think, okay, now he's done this so extensively that the church is disbanded, essentially, and he's successful, so he can stop. But that's not what happens in chapter 9. If he's been successful in getting this group of Christians to disband, then in chapter 9, he wants to take this show on the road, right? He wants to go on and see what else he can accomplish. Verse 1, so Paul was still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, and he went to the high priest, and he asked for letters from him to the synagogues of Damascus, that if he found any belonging to the way, both men and women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. What's Paul willing to use here? As a Pharisee, he's willing to use his speech. He's going to bring this issue up. He's willing to use the legal system. He's willing to work through those avenues and those channels to try to promote what he cares about. He's even willing to use the death penalty. He's in favor of putting these people to death, and he's willing to not just disrupt the church there in Jerusalem, but he wants to march into every synagogue his feet will take him to, and he wants to find if anyone in that synagogue believes in Jesus Christ. And so from city to city, he's looking to disrupt the followers of the way, as Acts puts it. So on my slide here, Paul's zeal as a persecutor was vigorous. Maybe vigorous is saying it too lightly. He is aggressive as a Pharisee. He is someone who is unrelenting. And of course, this is all very misdirected. But before we talk about the change, you need to see one other passage that highlights the kind of zeal that Paul had as a Pharisee. Come with me to Philippians. Philippians chapter 3 and verse 6 down through verse 8. There's something very telling about the way Paul uses the word zelos here in Philippians chapter 3, because it really speaks not just to this vigor or aggression, but it speaks to the extent to which he would promote his own beliefs and practices. Philippians chapter 3, verse 6, he says, as to zeal, how are we going to measure that? Well, if you want to measure my zeal, it's going to come in as a persecutor of the church. Think about the lengths to which you are willing to go to promote something that you believe in. You might just believe it and be content. You don't care if anybody else agrees with you. You know what you believe, and you're just going to hold that belief. Paul's not going to stop there. He not only believes something, he's going to support it. So I believe in this idea, or I believe in this group, or I believe in this agenda, and I'm going to get others, and I'm going to rally them together so that their zeal would be stirred up. But sometimes we believe it and we want others to believe it, but we'll go even a step further. Then we'll say, you know what? I'm willing to put my money where my mouth is. I will actually support this. I will actually contribute to this and give my time and my energy and my resources. But Paul's not stopping there. He believes it. He supports it. He gives to it generously, but he'll criticize anybody that disagrees with him, right? If you aren't a Pharisee, if you're not following the law according to his understanding of the Old Testament, he will tell you you're wrong and you're lost and you're displeasing to God. But he's not going to stop there. He believes it. He wants others to believe it. He supports it. He opposes people who disagree with him, and he will travel extensively to destroy people that disagree with him. Do you get that metric? Do you see what he's saying here in Philippians chapter 3? That when it comes to zeal, I'm not somebody that just believes this. I'll go all the way. I'm completely all in on this, even to the point that I would persecute others. we need to be careful about that. We need to realize that Satan would love to take our zeal and twist it in some of the ways that the Pharisees' zeal ends up being twisted. Come over with me to Galatians chapter 1 and verse 14. Galatians chapter 1 and verse 14. When Paul is, again, retelling kind of his past and looking at what his zeal was like, Galatians 1 verse 14 says to us, I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries among my countrymen, being more extremely zealous for my ancestral traditions. Now we can talk in a minute about his zeal for traditions, but right here, notice another measuring stick. He's not just measuring his zeal as it relates to persecution, but the extent of his zeal is, I want to compare myself to all of my contemporaries. I want to compare myself to the rest of the Pharisees. That's sometimes a trap for us that Satan would love to use in our zeal, that I need to compare my zeal to the zeal of the preacher in the next town over. Or I need to compare my zeal to the other Bible class teacher down the hall. I need to compare my zeal to these parents over here. Paul is measuring his zeal against his countrymen. Sometimes that can be helpful, but a lot of times that's a recipe for disaster. When we are measuring our zeal against other people instead of against God's holiness and against God's word, it's very easy to get going in the wrong direction and try to outdo another believer in our zeal. Paul is blind in some ways to the shortcomings of his zeal. And so, of course, we know the story that the only way for God to really open Paul's eyes was to just show him how blind he really was. To confront him there on the road to Damascus and help Paul begin to understand that his zeal was misdirected. You couldn't question its extent. You couldn't question its vigor, but it was very, very misdirected. So I want you to notice this. I came across this quote. Was, again, specifically researching for this lesson, found, what's the guy's name? J.C. Ryle. He was a preacher in the Church of England in the 1800s. He had this really interesting lesson on the zeal of Paul, and I want to share this quote with you. What I think happens when Paul's eyes are opened here on the road to Damascus lines up with this quote really well. Mr. Ryle says this about having a zeal for one thing. A zealous person in Christianity is preeminently a person of one thing. It's not enough to say that they are earnest or strong, uncompromising, meticulous, wholehearted, or fervent in spirit. They only see one thing. They care for one thing. They live for one thing. They are swallowed up in one thing, and that one thing is to please God. Paul had gotten away from that zeal specifically to please God. It was to outdo his countrymen. It was to stand apart from the other Pharisees. It was to restrict the freedoms and liberties of others. He had gotten away from this. This quote continues. He says, they have a passion for one thing. That one thing is to please God, to advance God's glory. And if they are consumed in the very burning of their passion for God, they don't care. They are content. They feel that like a candle, they were made to burn. And if they're consumed in the burning, then they have only done the work for which God has appointed them. I love that description of zeal. You know, he started on the previous slide with all those different things that in the workbook you'll study as the fuels, that courage and diligence and wisdom and loving service. All of those qualities are awesome. But what God has to do to transform Paul's zeal is to take that extent and take that vigor and get it back to this one thing. Can you say this about yourself? That you're a candle made by God, and if you are consumed in this life, then so be it. That's just what we were made for. But that our mission is to shine brightly, to please God, and to bring him glory. That's where we want to see Paul's zeal moving, and that's where we want our zeal to be moving. So let's look at some things that Paul had to learn. Things that he had to see were obstacles, that were dead ends, that were taking him away from the kind of Christ-like zeal that he really needed. First, of course, is pure motives in the heart of the doer. He has to come back and really think about what he cares about the most and make sure that his desire is centered on truly glorifying and honoring God. In the years since I published the workbook on Zeal, one of the shortcomings that has been brought to my attention and that I've seen several times is that I didn't spend enough time dealing with the desire part of this definition. That zeal is a burning desire to please God. That desire comes from a recognition of who God really is. His holiness, his worthiness. The way the Lamb is celebrated in the book of Revelation, worthy, worthy, worthy is the Lamb. I think of Mary when she anointed Jesus for his death. You know, in today's money, that's like a $30,000 or $40,000 vial of perfume. Who would you give a $40,000 gift to? Right, guys? Who are you going to buy a brand new truck for? Yourself, right? Who would you give a $40,000 gift to? Mary has it in her heart that for Jesus, I'll pour it out. He is worthy of this extremely valuable gift. Our desire to please God comes from appreciating how worthy he is. And I want to set that worthiness high above to get our focus and just see how these other 3 points just fall totally short of God's worthiness. What Paul had to learn is that zeal is just not going to be about the praise of men. It's nice when you're outpacing your contemporaries. It's nice when you do that performance evaluation at work and they check the box for exceeds expectations. But you know what? That's not what we were made for. That's not what our life is all about. Coming back to Galatians chapter 1 and verse 10, am I now seeking the favor of men or of God? Paul had to make a choice about that. If he was going to continue to seek the favor of men, he would have ignored that vision on the road to Damascus. But he's decided he's going to seek God. Am I seeking the favor of men or of God? Am I striving to please men? If I were still trying to please men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ. If our zeal is going to be transformed into as imitators of Christ, then we have to let go of just seeking after the praise of other people. Second thing Paul learns here is it's not about your party's agenda. And that could be political party, that could be religious party, that could be your socioeconomic clique, that could be whatever. If you're just seeking the agenda of one little group, that's always going to fall short. Come back to Matthew 23. Remember in Matthew chapter 23, as Jesus goes through the woes against the Pharisees, in verse 15, he highlights an example of their misguided zeal. Matthew chapter 23, verse 15. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees and hypocrites! You travel around on sea and land. There's that extensiveness again. You travel around on sea and land to make one proselyte, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. Woe to you, blind guides! Right? They're getting people to start following them, but it's all following them in the wrong direction. I think we have to appreciate that Paul learned to stop doing that. Jesus wasn't a Pharisee or a Sadducee or a Herodian or a zealot. Jesus was the Son of God. And he came so that we could be sons and daughters of God. His loyalty was to please the God who is worthy. When we talk about being just a Christian, that's a special thing. And we don't want to let go of being just a Christian. One of my great privileges in living in Atlanta is to do a lot of different studies around the city. And one of the great joys of the last year has been studying with students in Atlanta who are from mainland China and have been their whole lives not really had open access to good Bible study. And it's so awesome to sit across the table with young men and young women to say, you mean you can be just a Christian? You don't need a pope. You don't need a this. You can be just a Christian. You can use just the Bible. That's an option. I'm like, yes, that's an option. To see the light in their eyes reignites that spark in mine. And Paul is learning that lesson here and trying to pass that on. And then the third thing, the zeal is not for selfish gains. Paul has to warn Timothy about this multiple times because it would be so easy for Satan to distract this young preacher into pursuits for personal gain. So of course, in 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 10, as Paul is passing this wisdom down to the next generation, he's saying, hey, Timothy, pay attention here. Don't get sidetracked with the love of money. The love of money is a root of all sorts of evil. And some, by longing for it, have wandered away from the faith and have pierced themselves with many griefs. I'm from Tennessee, and I know we're not quite as southern as that, but I don't think we're too far north that you probably don't know a story of a friend that has shot themselves while cleaning a gun. You know, I've got a few different friends that just, boom, took off the tip of their finger. It's like, you really hate it when you injure yourself. Chapter 6, verse 10 is saying, no, you're injuring yourself when you're wrapped up in this kind of a pursuit. And there's not a lot of places in our culture today that are speaking up and saying, you are piercing yourselves with many griefs if your life is all about the love of money. We need to remember that and not let it take us away from our love to please the Lord. Very similar ideas in 2 Timothy chapter 3 in warning about those false teachers that are coming. So if this is what Paul has to get away from, if he has to come back and look at Christ's example, then what is he going to begin seeking under the influence of Christ? I think 1 Corinthians 9 shows us three really special things that we should be aware of that can kind of fuel our zeal. So please come back with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 7. We noticed at the very beginning of the lesson that Paul in Acts chapter 8 and Acts chapter 9 was going in and taking people off to prison, seizing their rights and overriding their personal liberties. Look at how things have changed in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, where now he's seeking the good of others, particularly by giving up his own rights. Chapter 9 and verse 7. Who at any time serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat the fruit of it? Or who tends a flock and does not use the milk of the flock? Coming down to verse 11. If we sowed spiritual things in you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share this right over you, do we not more? Nevertheless, we did not use this right, but we endure all things so that we will cause no hindrance to the gospel of Christ. Think about that for a minute. If you really want to see your zeal refined, there's going to be a self-examination where we ask, what rights am I giving up? Instead of taking someone else like he was, dragging them off to prison, instead of kind of manipulating and controlling everybody else's opinions and everybody else's rights, what sacrifices can I make for God's kingdom? If God is really my one thing, then am I willing to let go of my privileges and my liberties as quickly as Paul was willing to let go of his, right? The hardest one is when he says, if meat causes my brother to stumble, I'll never eat meat again. I'm like, ooh, Paul, you are stretching it there, man. We got barbecues coming next summer. But he is, like over and over and over, he's willing to give up his liberties. And you never saw Pharisees doing that, right? Think back to what you know from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Do you remember the stories of the Pharisees being quick to give up their own rights? No. This is where Paul's zeal is different as a follower of Christ. Go a little further in the chapter with me. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, look at verse 19. Verse 19. Though I'm free from all men, I've made myself a slave to all, that I may win more. To the Jew I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those under the law as under the law, though not myself being under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law, as without law, though not being without the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those who are without law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. And I have become all things to all men, that I may by all means, and stop. At the end of verse 22, some people have become all things to all men that they could sell a little more insurance or a little more Tupperware or a little bit more essential oils or a little more this or a little more that. Paul hasn't become all things to all men for his own self-advancement. Paul has become all things to all men that by all means I may save some. It is the salvation of souls that are driving Paul. It's something that he cares about so deeply. It's not just about climbing the ladder. It's not about recognition from others within his sect. He wants to see souls rescued. I love the way he does this in Acts chapter 17. Do you remember in Acts chapter 17 when he came into the city? That was Athens, right? Yeah. When he came into Athens, the chapter 17 says his heart was broken. He was greatly disturbed over all the idols that he could see. Did you ever walk downtown and look at how tall the buildings are, but feel greatly disturbed about the people that may be sitting in those buildings that don't know Christ? Feel greatly disturbed about the people in your neighborhood and on your street that are vigorously and extensively pursuing dead-end goals? Paul is greatly concerned when he sees the idols in this city, and he stops and he speaks to these people, desiring to rescue them from the empty and evil practices in their city. When I think about what we've already read from Galatians chapter 1, why was he so hard on the Galatians immediately in chapter 1? Because their souls were in danger. And if we would care about a child playing in the street, how much more do we care about a person playing with the fires of hell? How much more do we care about someone pursuing a life that ends in separation from God? Paul is fired up for the salvation of souls. He wants to teach sound doctrine, not just as a matter of principle, not just as a matter of fulfilling a checklist. He wants to teach sound doctrine because he knows it's going to protect people from those dead-end pursuits. He knows it's going to prepare them for the things that they are facing in their life ahead. I mean, I'm looking around in here and I see young families and I see young parents, and we're always thinking about how do we prepare our kids? And some of the older members here, you're thinking, how do we prepare those parents to prepare their kids, right? Paul has that kind of zeal to draw people back because he loves the salvation of their souls. And then thirdly, he's greatly interested in his personal holiness from the inside out. Beginning in verse 24, do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but only one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may win. Everyone who competes in the games exercises self-control in all things. They then do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. Therefore, I run in such a way as not without aim. I box in such a way as not beating the air. I discipline my body and make it my slave, that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified. If I go out on a limb a little bit and say that Scott probably tells you guys when he's preaching sometimes, hey, I'm preaching at myself on this point. That's exactly what Paul's doing at the end of chapter 9. He says, hey, I'm preaching to myself at this point. I've tried to make myself a slave to all, that I might save some. But I have to go back and check myself. I have to go back and make sure that I'm not running in such a way that I would miss that one thing that matters the most. I think these attributes of Paul's zeal really shows us a transformation that began there on the road to Damascus and what it means to be following Christ. But I got 3 minutes left and I got one slide, so we're in good shape. I think this lesson is more useful if we don't just talk about the transformation, but we talk a little bit about how he actually used this new and refined kind of zeal. See, what he ends up doing is having even more dedication than the dedication and the vigor that he had when he was a persecutor. Come back to Acts chapter 9 again. Acts chapter 9, we read in verse 1 and verse 2 about how extensively he was going to go, and he was going to go into all the synagogues and find anybody that might believe in the way. But notice verse 15. The Lord told Ananias, go. He's a chosen instrument of mine to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and the sons of Israel. For I will show him how much he must suffer for my name's sake. He's willing to go. He's willing to carry out that mission. He again repeats this kind of information in chapter 26 and verse 15 down to verse 18. As Jesus says, I am Jesus whom you're persecuting. Get up, stand on your feet. For this purpose I have appeared to you, not to appoint you a minister and a witness, not only to the things which you have seen, but also to the things which I will appear to you, rescuing you from the Jewish people and from the Gentiles to whom I'm sending you, to open their eyes, that they may turn from darkness to light, from the dominion of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and an inheritance among those who have been sanctified by faith in me. How Paul carried out this mission is impressive. The great extent that he would go to with even more dedication than he had as a persecutor, to go much further than he maybe even imagined. That extent that he talks about in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, we won't read it, but all those nights and beatings and difficulties and the stresses and the strains that he endured, Paul was willing to do that. And as he did it, he spoke the truth in love. We know that verse from Ephesians 4 if you've been a member here very long. To go and to speak, but to speak not with wrath, but to speak with a care for that person's soul. To go and to humbly depend on Christ. To know that he had thorns in the flesh, and that every person in this room, we could all write down what our thorn in the flesh is, what great difficulty we have. But rather than that being an excuse, for Paul, it was a reason to stay humble and to depend on the power of the Lord. And so what he ends up doing is he celebrates and commends the zeal of others. He talks about Epaphras. He talks about Titus. He talks about some of the other people that we're going to study this week in our assemblies together. And so it's not just about him, and it's not him saying, look what a great philanthropist I am, or look what a great public speaker I am, or look how much my speaking fees generate. No. He looks out and he says, look at these guys. These are the ones that fire me up. These are the people that keep me going. These are the Priscillas and Aquilas. These are the Phoebes and the Dorcas. These are the people that are out there. And I'm learning from their zeal because they're helping me to be that imitator of Christ. Not just a zealous Pharisee, but a zealous Christian. And I tell you this morning that being a zealous Christian makes all the difference. Thank you so much for your attention this morning. I look forward to the week together.